These dark blue marks that you see above these letters are called accent marks or sometimes diacritical marks. And in English, we use them when we're borrowing words from other languages and maintaining the original marks. Now, lots of other languages besides English use these marks more commonly in their words and letters throughout the language. But today we're going to talk about what these accents are and how you can apply them to your lettering. So just to point some of these things out before we get started with the specifics, we're trying to keep all of these accent marks on the same line. So I'm keeping them about halfway between the header line and the center line and keeping them consistent with each other. And then, so these are all of the ones that are above the X height. The one that's below is a little bit different. We'll talk about that. We're also trying to keep them centered above the letter. So if you look at where the center of the letter is, the center of the accent should be approximately right above it. And since we are on our slant line here, we're going to try keeping all of the accents to maintain that slant as well. So for example, rather than keeping our, that wasn't very great, rather than keeping the circumflex straight up and down, like reflecting across this vertical line, we're going to keep it along our slant line like this. So why don't we get into the specifics? All right, we're going to start with the acute accent. So the acute is coming from the right to the left, and you can do it two ways. You can either make it the same thickness throughout, so it would just be a straight, thick line, or you could start thick and transition to a thinner line, so it's almost coming to a point like this. So the shape would be something like this, coming to a point from a thick stroke. Now the acute accent, you might see it in words where the E is becoming an A sound, so like resume or fiance. It also helps to distinguish two words that sound different, so this isn't resume, it's resume, or expose could become expose with that accent. Also, in Spanish, we would use it for lots of words, but it indicates where the stress should be. So, for example, in the word como, if you didn't have an accent mark, you might think it's como, but having this accent here tells you it's como. So this first O is accented. This shows up very frequently in Spanish. Okay, the next one is called the grave or grave accent, spelled like grave, and comes down, so it's the opposite of your acute. So if you choose to make your acute accent just a straight line, do the same thing for your grave, or if you choose to transition from thick down to a point, then do the same thing for the opposite, the grave one. So you can either, it might work best to make the transition if you start from the bottom, same thing with the acute, like this. It's a little bit easier, as you've learned in our transition modules, depending on if you're right-handed or left-handed. So choose whichever one is easiest depending on the look that you're going for. This accent is used, so in English we use it if you want to emphasize or stress a syllable that normally wouldn't be pronounced. This accent also shows up a lot in French. For example, the word for brother, frère. But in English, if you just saw this word, you would say learned. So you're not pronouncing this last part, it's just going from the end of the D, learned. But if you want to call a man learned, you could add the grave accent. So key thing here is to make sure that these are just the same as each other but reversed. So staying along the same plane vertical area here. So if these were all in a line, they would all be on the same plane this way. And then also keeping them above the center of your letters like this. The next accent is the circumflex. So the circumflex is this triangular shape, trying to keep the axis of it along your slant line. And for English, we basically are using this accent when we're borrowing words from French. It actually used to, or it's to signify words that used to have an S that's now silent. So like the French word for coast. And when I'm doing this accent or any of the accents, I want to make sure that any other elements in the word aren't interfering with it. So for example, for this T next to the A, I would do the accent first and then the crossbar of the T, just to make sure that I'm getting this accent in, because it is so important to the pronunciation of the word. Next we have this accent, and I'm going to draw it first. So there's two ways to do it. You can either draw two circles like this and fill them in, or do two shades. So whatever you make your period, when we talked about period for punctuation, whether you're making it this shade or the dot, just choose the same one. And this is called, it has two names depending on the usage. So it's called a dieresis when you're using it to basically emphasize one vowel that normally would be with another vowel. So one of two paired vowels, pronouncing them separately. So let me show you an example. So for English, this would be a man's name, Noel, but if you add the two dots over it, it becomes Noel for Christmas, Christmas time. Same thing with like the name Zoe or Chloe. Okay, the other usage would be if you're changing the pronunciation. So this would be typically borrowed from German. You've seen the word Uber with the two dots above it. Also, okay, so for this example, I probably should have moved these over a little bit more so that they're right above the center of this U. Okay, so keeping our slant line accent like this. If my slant line goes directly through the U, then they should be on either side. So next time I'll make sure that happens. Now, it would also be used in Spanish. So one example would be, okay, so right now, if this were a normal I and a normal U, it would be pronounced lingüística. But by putting the two dots above the U, and we have an accent here on the I, it becomes lingüística. So instead of gui, it's gui. So we're changing the pronunciation. Oh, and so when we're using it to separate two vowels, it's called a dieresis. When it's changing the pronunciation, then it is called an umlaut. And then we have two more, and these are the ones that are above consonants. So the first is called the tilde. And there's two ways to do it. You could either, kind of like for the letter X, you can make the middle part thick, or you can make the two ends thick. So thin on the outsides and thick in the middle, or the opposite. And I'm sure if you're an English speaker, the first word that came to mind is piñata. We often borrow Spanish words like piña for pineapple or piñata. So if you see what I just did there, if you want to make the center of it the thick part, it helps to rotate your hand or rotate the paper. Because again, you want your thick strokes to be in line with the slant line or in line with whatever direction the thick line is. So typically it's along the slant line, but for this, since we're going in the opposite direction of the slant line, perpendicular to it, that's when you would need to rotate your hand or rotate the paper. So it's often used over N for Spanish words. Also in Portuguese, there are vowels that have the tilde over it. And then the last one is the cedilla. So this is the only one that's below. So you can kind of think you're going to come down, around, and up. It's kind of like the inverted C shape that we learned for the letter P and S. And this is just used when you're turning a C that normally has a hard C sound like K, and turning it into a soft sound like an S sound like in the word facade. So it's going to come directly, and I would start it where you transition from thick to thin, right where it hits the baseline, come down, around, and back up. So it's thick, down, and remember when we come to the side and back up, it's going to be thin. So that was a review of the accents that are used to change the pronunciation of letters and to borrow from foreign languages to the English language when you're writing. So if these come up while you're doing some lettering, just keep in mind the principles that we've talked about of consistency, thicks and thins, and making sure that things are along the slant line and centered.